we are inviting people in the community to record themselves reading aloud from a Jacqueline Woodson book or reading aloud from a story that they have written themselves. And what we hope to do on March 10th, on the day of her two presentations, is to have created a big community montage, if you will, of videos that show people of all ages, of all colors, of all races, reading Jacqueline Woodson or reading their own stories. And we hope that that is as good a way this year that we can celebrate story. We are going to be giving away through our curbside service, we'll be giving away journals. And so we're encouraging people of all ages to create stories and to write, and we've created some writing prompts for them from some of Woodson's books. So we're really using her talent as a master storyteller to inspire us this year. So that's what this is all about. And we are happy to have, right now we have 80 people here. Make sure that I haven't forgotten anything else. I don't think so. Let me tell you a little bit about Jill Hermann-Wilmarth, who is speaking tonight. And Jill, you can, once you start, you can let people know if you want them to mute themselves or turn off their cameras, or I would certainly recommend that you do speaker view so that you can get a good close-up view of Jill when she starts talking. Jill Hermann-Wilmarth, a former elementary school teacher, is a professor of social foundations in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University, which is located here in Kalamazoo. Her main area of research is LGBTQ-Inclusive English Language Arts Instruction, which she has been examining for over a decade and a half by theorizing children's literature, examining her own instruction in her teacher education classroom, and by co-teaching with both early and upper elementary school teachers in the Midwest. Her work can be found in the Journal of Literacy, Research, Language Arts, and the Journal of Language and Literacy Education, among other places. She is the co-author of Reading the Rainbow, LGBTQ-Inclusive Literacy Instruction in the Elementary Classroom. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jill.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think the rule is that you have to narrate when you're going to share your screen. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, but I don't know how to do it. And then put.
So do you have the, there you go.
There, I got it. And then let me see if I can put this into slideshow mode.
That first button under home.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, there we go. Hi, so first I'd like to thank Karen Trout and her committee for inviting me to be with you all here tonight. I don't have to say thank you for traveling through the snow to come hear me talk. So I'm glad I know we had someone driving in a car, but I'm glad you're mostly safely not driving through the snow. But her invitation has meant that Jacqueline Woodson's words have just surrounded me for the last few weeks. I know that my students, this is not the office that I teach from. My students, though, I know have seen my stack of Jacqueline Woodson books behind me. During our online classes, I sometimes feel like an elementary school student wanting just one more chapter. And so I steal some moments to read between classes, or while water is boiling or cakes are baking, or while I'm walking my dogs around our icy streets in the neighborhood or at the dog park. I've been listening to Harbor Me. So really in my head, all over the place. And I'm almost done with, but not quite, her newest Coretta Scott King award-winning book, Before the After is on my e-reader. So I'm reading everywhere. Her words have just been circling me. So only that last one is a first-time read for me, but I have never read so many of her books in such a concentrated time, and it has truly been a gift. So it's been a delight. So thank you, Karen. So Jacqueline Woodson is, she's amazing. She's written more than 30 books over the span of 30 years. It's kind of hard to imagine what that would be like to be able to produce. She has written adult novels, middle grades books, young adult books, picture books. 2 of her middle grades books are in verse. One of those middle grades books in verse won the National Book Award. It's just kind of amazing. She writes it all. She writes across genres, and these books are, they're amazing. She was born in Columbus, Ohio. She lived in Greenville, South Carolina for a little bit, and then she spent most of her childhood and her adulthood in Brooklyn, which these things if you've read her memoir, Brown Girl Dreaming, but you also know these things if you've read her books, because it comes up there, right? Brooklyn is such a character in so many of her books. She lives with her partner and children in Brooklyn. So she's one we could spend the rest of our time tonight talking about the awards that she has won. And I mentioned them because awards, provide legitimacy for books. They give, they show that an author is really doing this work, that it's valuable literature. And Jacqueline Woodson's books, her writing is often, quite radical for the times that she was writing in. And now she's been getting awards for really examining and investigating topics that many authors don't examine, especially in literature for children. So she has, she has won all of these awards that you see on the screen. She has been the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature and the Young People's Poet Laureate. Last year, she was named a MacArthur Genius. And alluding to just how much she values children and the communities, that she writes with and for, my favorite story about her winning an award comes from Jason Reynolds, who's another just amazing author and one of her friends and colleagues. And in a 2019 New York Times article, he reports this story of when she won her National Book Award, someone saying, a reporter asking her how it felt to win the biggest award of her career. And according to Jason Reynolds, her response was almost a reflex. Says who? Why is this award any different than the Coretta Scott King Awards that I've won? Why is it different than all the other accolades that you may not have heard of or that you may not respect? And I just love that she values so much the communities of people who read her books and for whom she writes. So of course, the National Book Award is quite an honor, but the Coretta Scott King Award also is. So Jacqueline Woodson, the OG of windows and mirrors. So the concept of windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors is going to run through this talk because it runs through Jacqueline Woodson's work. Dr. Racine Sims-Bishop, in the same year that Jacqueline Woodson's first book came out, published an article called Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors. And she was talking about books that can be mirrors. So books where people can see themselves in the characters, can see themselves in the stories. Window books are books where you can see people who are different from you. You can see other worlds that you don't live in. And sliding glass doors, using your imagination, you can enter into those worlds. And Jacqueline Woodson's books are just such an example of this theory in action. Her books are full of mirrors and windows for a whole range of readers. So there's Dr. Bishop talking to us about, now I've gotten my pages all messed up. Okay, so talking to us about windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors. In 1995, Woodson wrote an essay published in the Hornbook magazine about the invisibility of Black people in literature and what it meant for her to be a Black writer in the mostly white world of children's book publishing. She was 32 then and had just published her 7th book. So I'll just stop there and let us all think about what we were doing when we were 32. All right, now I'm going to continue. She said, I want to leave a sign of being here, of having been here. The rest of my life is committed to changing the way the world thinks, one reader at a time. So thinking more deeply about windows and mirrors, Rudine Sims Bishop recognized how much stories could bring to their readers. She conceptualized books as serving as both windows and mirrors. Mirror books, in her theory, are books that reflect readers back to themselves. They are books where readers are able to see something of their identities, cultures, or experiences in a text. Mirror books have the power to connect readers to entire worlds. They validate for readers that they are not alone, that their identity or life experience is not strange, that there might be a community of people just like them out there. Window books, on the other hand, give readers insight into another person's experience. Rather than show readers more of themselves, these books show the way into other rooms and worlds that readers haven't seen, but can imagine and learn from nevertheless. So as people, we need to see ourselves. So think of how many times you've searched for yourself in a directory or on the internet where you know you might be. We like that feeling of saying, hey, there I am. I can see this reflection of my life. I'm present. On the other hand, if we only saw ourselves all the time, our worlds would be limited to what we already know. We could get more than a little bit narcissistic, seeing only ourselves day after day. If, conversely, we are always learning about the worlds of others, we can feel lonely. We might understand that our view of the world is not the only one, but if we don't feel there's a place for us in that world, we can easily feel strange, isolated, and vulnerable. What that means then is that all readers deserve both windows and mirrors. It is that balance that helps us feel affirmed and also helps us move beyond our own limited experiences of the world. So the Cooperative Children's Book Center every year gets a copy of every piece of literature that's written for children, and they do an analysis. And so they look at racially who's represented in text. So this image they developed in 2018, you can really see the idea of windows and mirrors present in this graphic. And so in 2018, there are 50% of books written for children had white protagonists. 27% had animals. 10% had African-American and African protagonists. 7% Asian Pacific Islander and Asian Pacific America. 5% Latinx, and 1% American Indian and First Nations. So Woodson has written and said in interviews that she rarely saw herself represented in the books that she read as a child. In fact, that she read many books with animals as the characters, and she had been writing publishing since 1990 when this 2018 image was created. And so if 27% of the books in 2018 had animals as protagonists, we can imagine that her childhood was full of more books with animals than there were with books that represented her. Now in 2012, just 6 years earlier, you can see that it was even more overwhelming, the numbers of white characters in comparison to other characters in texts. And I'm gonna argue that Jacqueline Woodson is one of the reasons that that needle is moving, right? One of the reasons that people are seeing the value of having more books with a wider representation. Her writing of high quality, award-winning books has shown publishers and editors that people want to buy and read these books, right? And so she, and of course there are other folks doing that work too, but she has really been at the forefront of doing that work. The first book that I read by Jacqueline Woodson was from the Notebooks of Melanin's Son. It was published in 1995. Melanin and his mother lived together in an apartment in New York, and a pretty happy life, right? He's a middle school aged kid. And when she tells him that not only is she dating, but she is dating a woman, and not only is she dating a woman, but she's dating a white woman, we get to see through the eyes of Melanin what that is like for him. He talks about how white people have not really been a part of his world. They are his teachers, but they're not in his world. And he sort of explores why, why that is. He explores what it means to have, what does gay even mean? And what does it mean for him to have a gay mom? So I read this book in graduate school, which was a few years after I had been an elementary school teacher in Atlanta. And I just thought, wow, I wish that I had known about Jacqueline Woodson's work. I know that my students and I would have benefited so much from the kinds of conversations about the complex characters and topics that her books might have generated. As it was, this was one of the first times that I'd read a book for a middle grades audience that had a lesbian character. For me as a lesbian, this was groundbreaking, right? I had not as a child ever read a book where I saw that represented in the text. So while Melanin and his mom lived very different lives than I have ever lived, making this book very much a window book for me. When I hold it, as Dr. Bishop says, in just the right light, it becomes a shadowy mirror book for me, right? I could see some of who I am in that text. One of my favorite lines from the Notebooks of Melanin's Son comes in the first chapter. Melanin writes, "I'm on the outside of things. I wish it didn't matter so much, but it does, doesn't it? Difference matters." And we see this running through so many of Woodson's texts. What she knows and what she imbues into so many of her books is that difference matters and is important. That who we are as unique people isn't bad, but it is. And that those who are on the outside, those who don't fit into the neat boxes that are so often what we see in the movies, on television, and yes, in children's literature, difference is a thing that matters and that shapes the way folks can walk through the world. Woodson's books explore difference differently and without apology or hesitation. In a 2003 interview published in the Language Arts Journal, she explains that she never considered that her work would be considered controversial. She explains that she writes, quote, "about what I feel is real and a part of our world. I write characters that face circumstances and deal with them as best they can." So in this talk, you'll hear me talk a lot about Jacqueline Woodson, OG of Windows and Mirrors, and intersectionality. So she is a genius at showing the intersectional lives of her characters. So this graphic is, of course, not comprehensive, but it gets the idea of how identity can be layered. So Audre Lorde, who was an American civil rights activist and poet, wrote that there is no such thing, oops, I have a typo there, that there is no such thing as single issue lives because we do not live, single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Woodson's characters and stories are filled with joy and sorrow, challenge and ease. She shows us a complexity that is usually reserved, at least on the pages of children's literature, for white characters, and often for white and middle class or wealthy characters, and for straight characters. In her books for adults, this complexity challenges readers to learn more, to wonder about how our own families fit into the stories of class differences in family creation and friendship, in national tragedies like those spoken of frequently, such as 9/11, and those that are infrequently taught about, like the Tulsa Massacre. This is Kimberly Crenshaw here on the screen. She is a law professor and scholar, and during the Anita Hill trials, she coined the term intersectionality to really help us think about how our identities are layered upon each other and matter to each other. Woodson's characters invite conversations about intersectionality. So you might have heard this term. It's sort of been buzzing around for the past couple of years. A perspective of intersectionality understands that identities are multiple and layered. This means that people never experience just race or class or gender or sexuality, but instead exist in all of those categories simultaneously. So for example, in popular media, it's common to hear references such as African Americans and women. In this construction, African Americans are, when there's not further specification, assumed to be men, and women are assumed to be white. Well, then what happens for folks who are both African American and women? These various identity categories are not just stacked neutrally, however, but they are also mutually reinforcing. In other words, the structural factors that shape people's material realities cannot be accounted for with an additive model. For example, white women experience misogyny and sexism, and white women simultaneously experience those two things while experiencing white privilege, while Black women experience those while simultaneously experiencing racism. So this creates different material realities. When political movements or analyses highlight just one identity category at a time, or when children's books highlight just one identity category at a time, they conflate intra-group differences and fail to account for people's layered identities. The result, as Crenshaw says, is that those who experience intersecting oppressions are marginalized in multiple discourses and therefore relegated to a location that resists telling. Jacqueline Woodson does not resist telling. Her characters' lives are informed by how their racial identities intersect with their socioeconomic class, with their sexual orientation, with their geographic location. The layers are the story and the telling. So, for example, in The Day You Begin, one of her newer picture books, which is about being new and feeling different as children on this first day tell about their lives. Our protagonist feels more and more on the outside. There are times, man, I gotta move this, sorry, so I can see what the words say. There are times when you will walk into a room and no one there is quite like you. Over and over again in so many of her books, Jacqueline Woodson invites a telling. So this is from The Day You Begin, as is this, right? She acknowledges multiple layers. This is the day you begin to find the places inside your laughter and your lunches, your books, your travel, and your stories, where every new friend has something a little like you and something else so fabulously not like you at all. And in Brown Girl Dreaming, her memoir of becoming a writer, she acknowledges how scary it can be when you think that nobody has any of the same layers that you do. And she helps her readers through her characters consider where that fear comes from. And she shows her readers that there is truth in what they are feeling because, of course, her characters, and she by extension, and particularly in this memoir, have felt it too. You'll face this in your life someday, my mother will tell us over and over again. A moment when you walk into a room and there's no one, and no one there is like you. So I know that all the books that you are seeing on the screen are not on the Kalamazoo Reads book list, but they are the books that have been swimming in my head for the last few weeks. If pressed, I could not tell you which one was my favorite because I think they're all so different. And yet, Reading Brown Girl Dreaming can give you an idea of what has shaped both Woodson and so many of her stories. Readers can see her considering over and over again, troubling over and over again these ideas, using new genres, new iterations of themes, and searching for new ways of understanding the world through her characters and their lives. These are just some of the themes that she has addressed in her text. Her love of Brooklyn comes through the pages of so many of these books, as does her belief in the deep humanity of all people. So if you're reading After Tupac and Dee Foster, which is a chapter book for middle grades readers, alongside Visiting Day, which is a picture book, they are so much more salient when you know that she has deeply loved family members who have been incarcerated. While Tosh and After Tupac and Dee Foster and Daddy and Visiting Day are perhaps so very different, they are both deeply loved and deeply human. And you know, I can smell the thoughtfully made food and hear the travelers unwrap it on their long journeys to visit their daddies or their son and brother. Haley, too, in Harbor Me, is searching for her relationship with her own incarcerated father, with whom she hasn't lived since she was 3. Through the eyes of the children who love them, readers know these 3 men, one white, one queer, and one the recipient of pretty pictures from his little girl, to have full and complex lives that cannot be simplified by the word incarceration. Her picture books offer the gift of possible conversations, longer understandings, and explorations. And her chapter books remind us that the fabric of all lives are nuanced and textured and should not be overlooked, especially those lives that most often are. Jacqueline Woodson's fiction is truth. She says it's a way to feel legitimized in the world. And once they do feel legitimized, they can begin talking about it, feeling so outside and so other. I think it's helpful in getting young people to talk about their feelings. And I think it's helpful in getting teachers or parents or librarians or caregivers to have that dialogue because it is there in a book. So someone else must be thinking about it too. But I think we live in a country where it's hard for some people to talk about race, to talk about class, to talk about gender, to talk about sexuality, and within the context of books. I'm hoping my books ease the dialogue. This quote is from an interview published in 2020 between Woodson and Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, whose concept of windows and mirrors we've already thought about a little bit this evening. Jacqueline Woodson's words were meant to leave the page, to enter into our lives in ways that give us deeper understanding, that provide safe harbor for many, and a sliding glass door for those of us like me who live in bubbles of privilege. Her books can help us negotiate our own complicity in creating a country where people are uncomfortable talking about the topics and truths of people's lives. When you look at something like Another Brooklyn, it's the story of 4 Black girls and their life and what it means to be a Black girl in Brooklyn and what it means to be a Black girl in America and what it means to be a Black girl in the world. And again, I thought that story was valid and I thought there weren't a lot of people telling it. Of course, when I think of Toni Morrison's Sula, I would look to that for some of the inspiration behind it, but it's like, here we are living these lives. And where are our stories? And so for me, it's about telling those stories. Dr. Bishop asked Woodson about her work in a shelter for runaway and homeless youth. Her response provides insight into the characters she created. She says, "It made me realize how important it was that the young people in the shelters have stories that reflected their lives. I was young and I knew that I wanted to write for young people. It was before I even knew about the canon of children's literature. But I knew that the stories of the young people I was working with, even my own story to some extent, was not in the world. When I went to get books for those kids, there was Rita Williams Garcia, there was some Walter Dean Myers, and there was Mildred Taylor's book, but Mildred's book was not their story. Stories of young people living in underserved communities and having a lack of access, but still having all this hope and joy and veracity, those stories weren't there. So it definitely inspired me to write them, because what kind of audacity does the world have to not include the stories of these very important young people? One of Woodson's most salient gifts, I think, is how she centers the voices of young people. I think Harbor Me is such a great example of this. And really, if you get the chance, you should listen to the audiobook. A friend and colleague, we're in a teacher reading book group, and so we were all reading we're serendipitously reading Jacqueline Woodson books this month, and my friend Makeka told us you've got to listen to this. So I went immediately to the KPL website and checked it out. So I will return it soon, and you should listen to it. One, for the voices, that it's a cast of characters. It feels like you're listening to Reader's Theater, and then a true gift at the end. Jacqueline Woodson and her son interview each other, and it's such a joy to listen to. But there are different, so in the audiobook, there are different voice actors, including Woodson herself, as the wonderful teacher, Ms. Laverne. The emotion of realizing and understanding, such as how Black boys have shorter childhoods than white boys, or what it feels like to have immigration come and take your father and not knowing what might happen to him and your family, or what it's like to be new, comes through the voices of her characters that are in dialogue with each other without much prose surrounding their words when they're together in the text. Woodson's books also show all of us, but remind youth that there are communities where they belong. Sometimes, like in Harbor Me, these communities develop as a surprise, like when their teacher just puts them into a room together one Friday and says, you're going to hang together every Friday afternoon for the school year. And other times, like in After Tupac and Dee Foster, they might be separate from the main action of the story, like the narrator's church community in that book or Tasha's queer community, but they are central in the lives of the characters. And so we get to see how that community is active and present. Community as Harbor runs through another Brooklyn until it doesn't, and becomes the family in Park Slope when nobody was sure what life a teen pregnancy would turn into in Red at the Bone. It is the class in The Day You Begin and the girls on the fence in The Other Side. And these communities hold our memories, and our memories are our stories, and our stories give us humanity. After all, there's just something about memory. It takes you back to where you were and lets you be there for a time. Sadie says that in Red at the Bone. So in my role as a college professor, I've taught several of Woodson's books to my undergrads who are training to be elementary school teachers and middle school teachers. And I truly love having conversations with them about her books. But the most fun for me is to read and talk about her books with elementary school students. As a researcher, I've spent quite a bit of time in an upper elementary school classroom co-teaching English language arts. And for several years, I read After Tupac and Dee Foster with small groups of fifth graders. And with a class of fourth and fifth graders, I read and explored many of Woodson's picture books. It was a couple of years ago when she came to Kalamazoo. So we did a Jacqueline Woodson study. So perhaps many of you who are here this evening spend time with children in school or in out of school spaces and have the privilege of reading and learning with children of all ages. So I thought it might be interesting to think about and see what it might look like to explore some of the ideas in deeper ways as mediated by Jacqueline Woodson's stories. So it must have been 2006 or 7. Look, anytime Jacqueline Woodson is anywhere near me, I will go and hear her speak. So it must have been 2006 or 7, and she was in Grand Rapids at a library. And she told the audience how she imagined the story in The Other Side, which is a story about two girls, one Black and one white, negotiating their friendship. And she had imagined Clover and Annie's story as a contemporary one. And she told us that oftentimes the writers of children's books and the illustrators of children's books often do not communicate, as was the case here. And so the art, the beautiful art that E.B. Lewis provided for this book has an old-timey feel to it. But I wonder how children, and when I say children, I mean all readers, adults included, might imagine how different illustrations in our own neighborhoods and cities might help us see the ways that race and racism and history are at work in our daily lives. So this is from the first page of the book, and it reads, "That summer, the fence that stretched through our town seemed bigger. We lived in a yellow house on one side of it. White people lived on the other. And Mama said, 'Don't climb over that fence when you play.' She said it wasn't safe." When reading this book with upper elementary students, I asked these questions as I reached the end of the page. Are there fences or other things, visible or invisible, that divide Kalamazoo or the towns that we live in by race, by socioeconomic class? How many of you live near more than two families that are of different races than you? And the class was about 20% kids of color and the rest white. And not a lot of kids, not a lot of us were raising our hands. And I said, well, what do you think about the number of people raising their hands? And, you know, they were not ready to assign racism to the reason that there were not many kids raising their hands, but they were ready to sort of explore that deeper and think about, where are these lines of divisions? We talked about different neighborhoods in Kalamazoo and why they might be different, and really thought about how class is at work and how race might be at work. As good authors do, Woodson pulls us into the world she's created, but she offers us the opportunity to move back and forth between the world on the page and our own. If we're willing to think about the fences in our own lives, those that have been built by others and those that we are too comfortable to tear down, we might be willing to cross those fences. So this is a couple pages later, and look, I went to Google Images for these pictures, so that is why they are not centered. That is just a truth there of making a presentation, but I'll read it to you. It says, "This summer, everyone and everything on the other side of that fence seemed far away. When I asked my mama why, she said, because that's the way things have always been. Sometimes when me and mama went into town, I saw that girl with her mama. She looked sad sometimes, that girl did. Don't stare, my mama said. It's not polite. When we got to this page, we stopped. Let's make a list of things that are the way things have always been." And so this was in 2016 on the lead up, I feel like on the lead up to the election, or maybe, so students said things like, well, there's never been a female president. They said things like, well, gay marriage has changed. They said things like, not all of us used to be able to be in class together because we're not all white. So we talked about, when did those things change? And they were like, yeah, the president thing hasn't changed yet. Has that change been harder for some people? For whom is it more difficult? So again, when we put ourselves into the story, it can help us consider the structures that we've upheld, structures that separate, structures that maintain power for certain folks, and that maintain a lack of opportunity for others. Because this was one of our the first books we read aloud to the kids that year, this question set the stage for our conversations from September all the way to May. Students would ask things like, how is this book challenging the way things have always been? When we were reading books like Alex Gino's George, which is a short novel about a transgender fourth grader. I can imagine that question really informing how children try to make sense of current events just in the first month and a half of 2021. If we were to ask the question, how is this challenging or maintaining the way things have always been when we think about January 6th? You could really have some conversations there that could be mediated by this text. I can imagine certainly that question would be salient during a pandemic. How indeed are we cleaving to the way that things have always been? And how is this reinforcing the opportunity gaps that we sometimes fail to acknowledge? My mama says I shouldn't go on the other side, I said. Yeah, my mama says the same thing, but she never said nothing about sitting on it. Neither did mine, I said. And so when the kids and I chatted, we talked about what rules are meant to be broken. Which rules? Which rules are these girls breaking? And what are the unwritten rules that you won't break? And what are the unwritten rules that if you broke them, you'd feel okay arguing with an adult that nobody told me? Right? So as an adult, which rules are you willing to bend? If you think about Harbor Me and the teaching that the Friends of Color had to engage in around playing with the Nerf gun, right? In that book, they're talking about how unfair it is that all of a sudden they're not allowed to play with a Nerf gun. And the white friend says, well, I still play with a Nerf gun. And they talk about how that is unfair. And he's like, oh yeah, they're talking about a shooting of a child who was playing with a Nerf gun. It's like, oh yeah, that might have happened to me. And they're all like, not really, right? So they have to do this sort of teaching and thinking, right? So they have to talk about how some rules can be different for different folks. And when we hold these ideas in our heads, certainly for me, it can make me feel frustrated and angry, but it can also spur us to action to think about bigger change. And I know that might feel like a big leap, but what if? What if we challenge ourselves and our children to come up with creative ways to challenge and change the way things have always been? What if we become a part of a larger movement that does that work? A book alone, of course, might not do that, but it might be a way to facilitate that conversation, that thinking, and that action. So I know I said I don't have favorites, but I really do love After Tupac and Dee Foster. And so while the committee that I was not on did not choose to put this on the list of the Kalamazoo Reads books, I think you should all check it out from the library. So in this book, Woodson, and thus the fifth grade students I was reading with, explores topics ranging from foster care to misogyny and homophobia and rap lyrics to police brutality against Black people to incarceration to Black queer lives. These kids chose the topics that were interesting to them. They learned research skills and wrote reports that they shared with their classmates so that they could all have a deeper understanding of the context of the novel. Two of the fifth grade classes I taught this book with came to Western to talk about the novel with my undergraduate students who had also read the book. I started those sessions by telling the fifth graders with my students there too, that sometimes adults don't think kids their age can handle books like this that address topics like these. What do you think? And first, I will tell you that those fifth graders will be happy to tell you that, yes, they certainly can handle books like that. And second, they're excited to tell my students who are training to be teachers why. We can talk about the lives of people who we're in the world with. When we trust our children to be able to talk about people's lives who are both different and similar to them, when we ask them what they think, and when we trust that they do think, the possibilities can be endless. So these kids that I was teaching wrote letters to characters, wrote journal entries expressing how the pain and questions and joy of the characters made them feel, drew comic strips exploring how different characters might act in different situations, and one student even wrote a play. The teachers listening this evening can likely see many of the skills and ELA concepts that they are expected to teach alive in these projects. And certainly that is important. But what I remember more is the conversations one group had as we read about a police officer chasing the teenage brother of one of the protagonists as he ran home from basketball practice. The book mediated our conversation about the murder of Black people at the hands of police. I remember when one of the few Black students in my undergraduate class brought a huge smile to one of the fifth graders when she leaned over and said, "You think Tupac's still alive?" Yeah. Their theorizing brought so much joy to the room that day. We talked about expansive families and standing up for your friends and learning hard things. And all of this was as much a part of what learning was in that classroom, and I think should be, as any other skills that we teach our kids in schools. Jacqueline Woodson's work is so timeless. In After Tupac, there is one scene. "Brothers be hunted," Jay Jones said one Sunday morning. I wanted to tell Jay Jones that sisters were hunted too. One fifth grader called After Tupac and Dee Foster, which is set in the mid-1990s, historical fiction, immediately making me feel approximately 70 million years old. 25 years later was the summer of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and so many others. Woodson's stories, all of them, help us look backward to look forward. They are historic and contemporary. They are joy and pain. How lucky we are to live in a world where she invites us into hers. At some point, all of this, everything and everyone become memory. Woodson invites us to remember, to enter in and out of memory, to learn and relearn, and to open the door to hearing another story. So we've talked about how prolific she is, how she's changed publishing and representation in literature, how she really considers windows and mirrors and has from jump, how she presents intersectional lives of characters, how she does not resist or shy away from telling these stories. And we've thought a little bit about classroom conversations. So that is what I have for you. I'm going to figure out in a minute how to stop sharing my screen. And I would love to talk about the books. What's your favorite? What questions do you have? I really don't know how I'm going to do this. Here we go. Stop sharing. There we are. So thank you for listening to me talk at you for a long time. That is not my usual teaching style, but I would love to open up for questions.
For Jill, you can just either unmute or raise your hand, and I can go ahead and unmute the people who want to ask a question. So let me go through and see if any hands are up, or if anybody wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. Just to warm it up, as a youth librarian myself, and not really until I became a youth librarian at Kalamazoo Public Library and started reading Jackie's books. Have you discovered in your teaching of her works that a lot of your students are missing out on this golden age of youth literature and teen literature right now, and they're just shocked that they miss these things?
Yes, yes, I do find that they didn't know that these books were out there, and yeah. So I always send them to the library, but sometimes it's so hard. Well, now we're not walking in, but when you walk in and you see all these spines, what to look for, right? So just knowing that. So I try to provide book lists for students or to help them think about authors, because there is so much out there. And I think so often teachers have so much on their plates, and so much to worry about fitting in, that finding time to read and share new text is really hard. And so I see evidence of that in my teachers, so in my students. And so absolutely. But I do get excited when they get excited. And then when they're like, how could you teach a book like After Tupac with kids? And then to have kids be like, look, we got this, is really, that's my favorite thing.
For introducing these books. It's going to take people teaching teachers like you to start shining a spotlight in some of this great teen literature that people are missing. And there's teachers still stuck on trying to teach Scarlet Letter. It's,
Well,
when
and
there's other
sometimes
books.
it's not their choice, right? So,
Yeah,
so I
exactly.
think, yeah.
Jill, can you see the chat?
I can see the chat. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I love Each Kindness so much. It's just, I mean, to me, her picture books are not just for children. I'm just looking in the chat. Someone Ed Spicer mentioned Each Kindness. Yeah, it's so beautiful, isn't it? And really, so I mentioned that I'm in this teacher book group with some other researchers and teachers from across the country. One of the benefits of folks being comfortable with Zoom. And one of our teachers the other night said that he had requested from his library Each Kindness, and the librarian said, oh, but it's so sad. He read it and the kids were like, no, they learned something. This is not a sad book. And really listening to our kids and listening to what they see in these texts is such a valuable thing. Yeah. Now I want to listen to Red at the Bone as an audio.
Any other questions, or there are some nice comments here in the chat as well? Oh, here's a question.
Yeah. So it's really hard. I tell my students all the time, I'm a children's lit nerd. I read to them, even though they're in college, and it can be really hard to like help them see all of it. But I think slowly and stopping and asking questions. And so, when I was preparing this presentation, I am a huge fan of Google Docs, I will tell you. And so I had all of my prep for those years that I was in that 4th and 5th grade classroom, and I just searched to the other side. And I had a page by page, here's the way you can stop and talk with students. And so really, to me, knowing who your students are and reading through and thinking about what kinds of questions will help them engage. What am I trying to help them think about, and how can I stop and think with them? Of course, not every page, that would get cumbersome, but really thinking about what's my purpose in using this text, and how can I help my kids really think and provide so many opportunities for them to share. I don't know how old the kids are in your Sunday school, but I have found that kids who are shy, or students who are shy to speak, are happy to write an idea in the chat. So how can you use the technology to help your kids really engage in new ways, is what I might say. Carrie, I'm so excited that you're thinking about those questions. One of my favorite things to do as a teacher is get kids to think about broader questions, right? So even when on the other side, when we're thinking about what rules are these girls breaking, I mean, when they're sitting on the fence together, right? So of course they're breaking the fence, maybe the rule of the fence, but also girls are holding hands. When does that rule stop being a rule? When you are allowed to hold hands and when you're not, and really talking about that with kids, right? What is it? I think one of the questions was about how it feels to be left out, like wondering what the girls on the fence are thinking, because a new friendship between two of them has developed that didn't include everyone. And so what's it like to not be included? What does that feel like? Where have you seen that? What sometimes causes people to not feel included? And so really thinking about those bigger global topics that can help kids think outside of the text and inside the text. Yeah.
Well, Jill, I want to thank you on behalf of Kalamazoo Public Library, and everybody that is here is now considered a part of our community, even if you're not in Kalamazoo. So that means that you are invited to participate in our celebration of story, and you're invited to record yourself reading from any of Woodson's books or reading from your own stories if you'd like. We can certainly continue this. People are still adding to the chat, but it is 8 o'clock and we just are so grateful to you for this great presentation.
Thank you all for coming. It's such a delight.
There's another question. Which
Yes.
book would you recommend for a family dealing with the new knowledge of their college freshman who has just announced that he's gay? I believe.
Excellent for the adults, right? One of the things I love about Jacqueline Woodson is they are not issues books. In children's literature scholarship, there's a lot of conversation about like issues books, and they're so didactic, right? So to me, just seeing that lives are lives. And so not knowing a lot about the young person you're talking about, you know, one of the things that I really love about After Tupac and Dee Foster is that his mama is really struggling with Tasha's queerness. I mean, she really is, but those little girls just love him, right? And so to me, that's a great one, but I'm biased, right? So, I mean, and even like in Red at the Bone, I don't want to spoil it, but like there's some college queerness going on in there, and it's not a real thing. Yeah, Boy Meets Boy is a great book. It's not Jacqueline Woodson, for sure. There's a ton of there's not so many middle grades books about, and middle grades are more where my scholarship is, but there is a ton of YA with LGBTQ characters that I know your librarian could help you with. So.
So thank you very much, Jill, and good to see you, Ed. And I'll see you later, Karen.
Yep.
Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.